Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about corporate and governmental deviance. And this is a different kind of way of looking at white-collar crime. Currently, when we've been talking about white-collar crime, most of those discussions have talked about individuals that are committing deviant acts. Today, what we're going to talk about is actual corporations or actual whole units of government that are committing white-collar offenses. So, like I previously stated, most discussions of white-collar crime look at individuals who commit crime in the course of their professions. This text in this lecture is going to look at the whole organization that could be viewed as committing a criminal act as opposed to just these individuals. So how do you study organizations as deviant? How do we even conceptualize organizations as deviant actors? Well, there's a couple things that we need to look about as far as the structure of organizations that might lend themselves to being kind of breeding grounds for this deviant behavior. The first is if you look at positions as building blocks, right? So, for example, people are empowered by the positions they hold. A CEO has more power than a secretary or admin in a corporation, even though both are just individuals, right? There's nothing really inherently unique about the CEO versus the admin other than the position that that individual holds. If the CEO steps down and someone else becomes CEO, the power dynamic changes because the position is what gives them power, not who the individual is as a person. And so that's important. These kind of positions are the unique things that have the power, not the individuals filling those positions. In that same vein, people are replaceable. So organizations have large turnover with little effect on the day-to-day operations, right? For example, at Flagler College, President Joyner took over as the president of the college. When that happened, did anything substantively change about the running, the operation, or the mission of the college? Not really. Of course, President Joyner is a different leader than the former president, President Behl, and there have been some subtle differences in their management styles and leadership. However, the college is still an educational unit. All of the professors more or less maintained their jobs. The basic structure of the college didn't change. And so organizations might have a lot of turnover, but the day-to-day operations largely remain pretty much the same regardless of who's in those positions. One day, I am not going to be around anymore. Does that mean that criminology will no longer be taught? Certainly it doesn't. Organizations also influence thought and action. So job titles and descriptions are specific, and you're really not supposed to deviate from your job that you have. If you were to walk around a college campus and see a professor with a mop and a bucket mopping the floors, everyone would think that that's very, very odd. Why? Well, the professor's job is to teach. The custodian's job is to mop the floors. In the same vein, if a custodian came into the classroom and decided to start lecturing, everyone would kind of scratch their heads and say, well, what are you doing? That's in large part because we group people in these organizations in their job titles, in their job descriptions. Any deviation from those job titles or job descriptions is viewed as very, very odd. So accounts payable needs to worry about paying the accounts. They don't need to worry about payroll. Accounts receivable needs to worry about collecting money, not worrying about how they're going to pay the bills. So the structure and operation of organizations can also encourage deviance in three ways. So we have the structure of the organization, right, with this idea of positions as building blocks and people being replaceable. But there's also ways that deviance can be somewhat encouraged or promoted within this framework. And there are three kind of categories here: limited information and responsibilities, elites being able to cause deviance by establishing norms, rewards, and punishments for deviance, and initiating deviance and using linked positions to implement this deviance. And we're going to talk about all of these in detail. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is limited responsibility, right, and information. No one job can be completed by one person, right? So every job has several different people working on it. And there's a lot of different reasons this could be, right? This could be due to commitment to the original idea, maybe fear of public backlash or embarrassment, or by the time something went wrong, it's too late. But no one job can be completed by one person, right? So, for example, there's a British car that was made that forced gear changes that ended up being leading to a faulty design, right? It was forcing gear changes and it caused the car to not function as it was supposed to. In that case, who is really at fault for this deviance, right? Is it the designer's fault? Is it the engineer who made the car? Is it the builder who actually, hammered the car together? Is it the salesperson who sold the car? It's really unclear who's really responsible. There's limited information and responsibility here, right? And so even as we start to realize things might be going wrong, right? And this is where we get back to the commitment to the original idea. We're so convinced that this one way is going to work. We're so committed to that original idea that we don't kind of blow the whistle on it or stop what's going on. There's also, again, this fear of public backlash or embarrassment. We don't want to admit that something that we did was wrong. We just kind of go around it. I'm sure we've all been in cases in either relationships with our parents or romantic relationships where you suddenly realize you did something wrong, but you're still going to fight your point because you don't want to admit that you were actually wrong. There's also, by the time we realize what went wrong, it's too late. Like, oh no, we really made a bad car here. What do we do about it now? Let's just stop making the car and maybe no one will notice. There's also deviance that's indirectly traceable to organizational elites. Leaders might have a problem that needs to be solved, and so they delegate this problem to task forces or subordinates to achieve the goal. But this delegation might cause deviance. I don't care what the problem is, just fix it, right? Well, that could suddenly become somewhat problematic, right? Because if what you're the most worried about is getting a different result, you might start sacrificing the ethics or the morality of what it is that you're doing to get that result for that leader. Beechnut apple juice is a perfect example of this. Beechnut apple juice started off in its first iteration as 100% juice. It was very proud of the fact that it was 100% juice. Well, Beechnut was sold to another company who bought it for a profit and said, okay, we need to make our money back in X number of years. Wow, it's really expensive to make apple juice. So they said to their design team, figure out a way to make apple juice cheaper. What they figured out was if they watered down the apple juice a little bit, it was suddenly cheaper because it wasn't as expensive to juice all these apples. The problem is it still 100% juice? Not really. Also, can't you kind of tell when stuff is watered down? So what do you have to do when you water stuff down? Well, maybe add a little bit extra sugar, a little coloring to it to make it still look like apple juice so it doesn't look so watered down. Over several iterations of this, Beechnut apple juice was sold several times. New owners continued to require cost cutting somewhere, and what they ended up doing was making an apple juice drink that no longer had apples actually used in the apple juice. It was all just chemicals mixed together to give it the look and taste and smell of apple juice. However, it was still advertising as 100% juice when there weren't even juice in a single apple to put in any of their juice. And so the owners said, find cost cutting somewhere, and the place that the followers looked was monkeying with the formula of the apple juice until it was no longer even juice. And then there's deviance that is directly traceable to organizational elites. So in the previous example, right, with Beechnut apple juice, it wasn't like the leaders said, monkey with the apple juice and make it worse, right? They just said, figure out ways to cut costs. You come back with a balance sheet that shows costs are cut and the leaders are happy. This is not an accident. This is not people misunderstanding what the leader's saying. This is the leaders saying, we are going to be deviant here, right? Oftentimes, elites use deviance directly in ordering their subordinates to do something unethical. And a perfect example of this is FDR with Japanese internment camps during World War II. America had pretty strong anti-Japanese sentiment prior to World War II. For whatever reason, we just did not particularly care for the Japanese. Then, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. That gave the excuse to do some pretty racist stuff against Japanese Americans, right? Japanese Americans were known by the intelligence community to pose no real danger. In fact, we had a lot of Japanese Americans that served in the war fighting Japan. However, FDR still wanted them rounded up and put into internment camps. And so they used Pearl Harbor as that excuse to do it as a direct order by FDR in a form of governmental deviance and also in an extremely unconstitutional act. So there are several stages of corporate deviance we're going to talk about also. Like anything in life, corporate deviance doesn't just fall out of the sky. It's kind of a slow process that ends up happening, right? So organizational deviance typically goes through these three stages. The first one is initiating deviance, right? One or maybe many individuals commit a deviant act. And if you think about this, for those of you who have seen the movie Wolf of Wall Street, that's kind of a common example of this. Jordan Belfort goes to this penny stock place in a strip mall and says, hey, I get 50% commission on anything I sell. So if I sell $10,000 worth of stock, I get $5,000 of it? Yes. Okay, I'm going to start doing that. He starts making money and making a lot of money, and then he slowly, that behavior, even though it was super unethical and he was pushing a bunch of junk stocks and junk bonds that were not worth anything, it became institutionalized, which is the second step here. The behavior takes on a life of its own and becomes very, very normal. An example of this could also be campaign finances prior to Citizens United, right? It might start off that a couple politicians were maybe taking a little bit of extra money that maybe they shouldn't have, kind of under the table, and then over time it became very, very common, and now especially, even prior to Citizens United, but it became very, very common for corporations to give, in some kind of ways, a tremendous amount of money to politicians for their political campaigns. And then the third kind of stage is the reaction to it. The public finds out about the deviance, or whistleblowers alert the public to the deviance, and consequences, if any, are doled out. Ironically, these consequences tend to be very short-lived or very easily overcome. A lot of corporations that we have heard of have committed a lot of deviance, even several iterations of deviance that are still publicly traded companies on the New York Stock Exchange today, and corporations that we've all heard of and are very, very familiar with, right? And so typically these reactions, right, the public finds out about it, and that's when the behavior stops, because of the outrage or because the public found out about it. Rarely is it that the company comes forward and says, hey, I made a boo-boo, please forgive me. It's typically, uh-oh, you guys found out about it, and then they start begging for forgiveness. So going back to Sutherland did an in-depth analysis of corporations that have committed white-collar offenses, and he examined 70 of the largest manufacturing, mining, and mercantile corporations at the time for white-collar crime. In the original article where Sutherland posted this, actually, there was such a fear of retribution and legal action that the corporations' names were hidden. But since enough time had passed, the corporations don't mind being listed. Now, that in and of itself is a very, very interesting idea, right? Enough time has passed, there's new CEOs, new board of directors, so they say, it's fine, go ahead. You can say that we did sketchy stuff in the past. Where else in society would we be okay with that? Would anyone be like, yeah, it's been 20 years. You can tell people that I committed murder. Or, no, it's fine. You can tell my wife I cheated on her 20 years ago. It's not a big deal. Of course not. And yet, for some reason, corporations, they're so emboldened by the fact that deviance is so common that they're like, enough time has passed. Go ahead, name us. It's not a huge deal. White-collar crimes were also limited, right? And so this is another interesting aspect of Sutherland's initial piece, right? Was they were limited to restraint of trade, misrepresentation and advertisement, infringements of patents, trademarks and copyright issues, unfair labor practices, rebates, and some of these other crimes. It was not an in-depth list or an exhaustive list of white-collar offenses. It was limited to quite a limited number of actual white-collar crimes, and many of the violations were settled out of court for a bunch of reasons. About half of the violations were settled out of court. And it's unclear what those litany of reasons maybe were. So what did Sutherland find? Results show that the average decision against a corporation in this time period is 14. Right? So the average corporation had 14 decisions in some capacity, 14 violations of these rules in some capacity. The highest had 50, which is a lot in a very short amount of time. Now let's look at some of these corporations that we've probably heard of, like General Motors. In this very short period of time, had 40 decisions against them. Sears, although Sears is starting to be defunct now, had 39. Ford, a lot of us probably drive Fords, had 28 decisions. General Electric, I've got a whole kitchen full of GE appliances, had 25 decisions against them. The total number of decisions was 980. And remember, there's 70 corporations here. 70 corporations had a total number of decisions of 980 decisions against them. 60 corporations had restraint of trade. That's 6 out of 7 corporations had a restraint of trade issue. 53 had patent violations. 44 had unfair labor practices. Also, corporations in the same industry tended to kind of hang together in their total number of violations as well, suggesting that violations were actually industry standards. So in order to be successful in the automotive industry, yes, Ford had 28 decisions against them, but probably at the time, so would have Honda, Toyota, Um, General Motors right there is another one that had quite a few decisions also. And so the industries in and of themselves are basically defined by their deviance, which is a very interesting idea. So where were the decisions decided? And this is where the Tappan-Sutherland debate comes back into play. Where were these decisions decided? 158 were decided in criminal courts, 296 in civil, and 129 in equity courts. So of these 900 and something decisions, there were 583 decisions by courts. The other half, like we talked about, were handled out of court. But even more interestingly, look at the percentages here. There was 583 total decisions, but only 158 in the criminal court, which means the vast majority of these decisions were decided outside of criminal courts, which again kind of backs up Sutherland's argument that they don't need to be decided in criminal court to actually be criminal, right? Other courts are taking the heavy lifting of these white-collar offenses. And this does kind of hurt Tappan's argument a bit too. The vast majority of these violations also happened within 10 years of Sutherland writing the article, which suggests that white-collar crime was on the rise. But what's also interesting is that at this time, the prosecution of businessmen, which used to be avoided, is also now being pursued. So we start seeing that businessmen are starting to become more prosecuted as time goes on. And now in society today, again, this was in the 50s and 60s, in society today, the businessmen are now being much more heavily prosecuted. If Bernie Madoff did what he did, or the Enron folks did what they did back in the 20s or 30s or 40s, they may not be sitting in prison today. So Clenard and Yeager decided to extend Sutherland's work and extend the data, and found that about 60% of corporations had at least one action brought against them since Sutherland stopped collecting data. The average was about 4.4 decisions. However, this also does mean that 40% of corporations did not have any actions against them, which suggests that deviance is not actually necessary in business. You can have a successful business and run a successful corporation without deviance, just like you can run a successful football program without recruiting violations. You can run a successful business without actually breaking the law. This does not necessarily mean that these corporations are all clean, quote unquote clean, but it does suggest that it is possible to run a clean business and be successful in it. Although 60% of corporations did have violations, it's also important to note that 42% of that 60 had multiple charges against them. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for this. It could be that one violation led to closer scrutiny of the corporation, leading to more violations being detected or discovered. Some of those 40%, if they did an initial scan and found no violations, maybe they just ignored those corporations when there really was, if you really dug in deep, maybe some minor deviance happening. However, violations of differing types also suggest that the corporate atmosphere in and of itself led to violations. So it's not like these corporations had all accounting issues or all product design issues. They may have had a mix of different types of deviance. If you have multiple different types of deviance, then what is it about that corporation that's encouraging and promoting that deviant behavior? And finally, what's very interesting is that large corporations are overrepresented in deviance. So even though only 60% of the corporations that were analyzed had violations, 3/4 of those violators were large corporations. So the larger the corporation, the more likely there is for deviance. Now that could be for a number of reasons, right? The more kids I have, statistically, the more likely one is to be a criminal in some capacity, right? Because I'm just increasing my chances with each kid I have that one of them is going to break the law in some capacity. So it could be that with a large corporation, the more people they have, the more likely it is that deviance happens. Or it could be that something about large corporation with a lack of oversight is a breeding ground or allows for more deviance, right? In the parenting analogy, maybe it's because two parents can't keep a close eye on 12 kids, right? Like they can one kid. And so maybe it's just a lack of oversight. However, there is something here to this idea that large corporations are overrepresented in deviance. So that's all we're going to talk about today. I want to thank you so much for your time, and we will chat soon.